Hello, everybody. Let's talk about the practical skills we need. And when I ask myself that question, I immediately think, well, what's the language the American people speak already? When I travel to different countries, I try to learn a few words in the local language. So I ask myself, what's the language that Americans speak? So let me just do a quick poll. How many of you watched part or all of the NCAA finals, basketball finals? Thank you. How many of you watched all or part of the Super Bowl? Great. And how many of you tend to vote in midterm elections? Okay, thank you. So what I'm noticing about America is that we love our sports. When there was a book written called The Smartest Kids in the World, and they polled the countries in the world that tend to produce the smartest students who go to college, et cetera, they found out that those students were at schools in countries like Korea and like Poland and like Finland, where they studied really hard. And when they then came to America to study and they said, what's different? They'd say, well, in America, a lot of the schools I went to, particularly the high school level, they cared more about their football team than they did about their grades. And they were noticing that Americans really value sports. So I started watching this year the Super Bowl and the NCAA finals closer and closer than I ever have. And what I noticed is that they've got some clues to the transpartisan practices we need. Because in those stadiums, in those football stadiums, in those basketball stadiums, you've got thousands and thousands of screaming people who are rooting for opposing sides. And they want their team to win. And when they don't win, they get really angry. And I'm thinking, how is this going to be managed? How do they manage this? Because in politics, it's pretty messy. So I watched both the Super Bowl and the NCAA finals, and they didn't always go the way I wanted them to, the outcome. But I thought both of them were incredibly powerfully handled events. And I looked at it and I said, well, how did that work? And what can we learn from that about politics? Not that politics is a game. It's deadly serious. It's about life and death, particularly if you're a soldier sent to war, or if you're a patient going to a hospital where you're caught in a system, or if you're dealing with the IRS. These are serious issues, but what can we learn from these games that we say we love? Do we really need to learn absolutely, totally new skills to be transpartisans, or do we actually already know them? So let's just take the Super Bowl. The Broncos and the Seahawks. Which team organized that event? Well, neither. The NFL organized it. Kentucky and UConn, who organized the NCAA finals? Well, imagine if Kentucky or UConn had organized them. Disaster. It was the NCAA that organized them. And it didn't take place in Connecticut or Kentucky. It took place in a neutral venue. A neutral venue. So you're starting to get the picture. So let's go back to those sporting events and let's say that the first tool that I noticed they used is a neutral or a third side convener. What do I mean by third side? I mean, it wasn't side A or side B that organized those events. It was a neutral league or organizing force that said, let's organize this event so it's handled well. Contrast that, my friends, to the Federal Election Commission. Federal Election Commission was organized some years ago to track money in politics and to organize and make sure everything was done fair and transparently. Well, what happened? The Democrats appointed their 3 people on the board. The Republicans appointed their 3 people on the board. And they required 4 votes for the FEC to do anything. Well, guess what the FEC does? Nothing. Right. They can't get their 4 votes. So thank God, that the referees, to go to the next tool, that the referees at these events are not hired by the Seahawks or by the Broncos. They're not hired by Kentucky or UConn. They're hired by and trained by and chosen by and paid by a neutral third-party convener. So that's the second ingredient. If the first ingredient is a third-party convener, the second is referees that you can trust, effective, trusted referees. And in those rooms at the U.S. Congress retreat, in addition to the facilitators that were in the room, we had trained a Democrat and a Republican to be co-leaders. So there were the 2 sides present, and then the facilitator, that was the third side. They were the 3 who had to be responsible for something effective in a room. Imagine a room at the retreat where the only facilitator was a Democrat or the only facilitator was a Republican. So that's the second tool that's vital. We need to have effective, fair referees. And in your work, if you want to do this kind of transpartisan work, both of the tools that I've mentioned so far, both of the practices I've mentioned so far, think about, how do I do that? How in a difficult situation, whether it's fracking in Colorado or women's rights, women's reproductive rights, or climate change, if you have opposing sides, how are you going, who's the neutral convener? And when we brought together, once in one of the series of dialogues we've done on a transpartisan basis, we brought together 24 people around the issue of climate change. Al Gore and a number of people on that end of the spectrum, and a number of people who are sort of anti-Al Gore, who taken out attack ads against it, etc. 24 from across the spectrum. Well, we could not convene them by calling it climate change. We had to call it climate change and energy independence, because we had to have a title that would bring everybody there, and we had to have people who were organizing it, including some of the speakers here. We had to have people organizing it that they trusted. They had to be a trusted convener, and then there had to be referees they could trust. But there is a third and very important ingredient, because if you're a referee, you're only as good as your rule book. Do you know what the rules are? And are the rules shared rules? Are they shared, fair rules? And is there a shared, fair playing field? Imagine if you saw the NCAA finals and you said, wait a minute, that hoop is smaller than that hoop. Or, wow, that goalpost seems a little off to the side to me and a little smaller. Is that true? Imagine if you found out, for example, that one of the referees was actually the brother or sister of the coach of one team. What? You know, or that one side was being paid. I mean, there's all sorts of ways you can see that, oh, that would immediately destroy your confidence in that game. It would immediately affect the quality of the game. And you'd say, that's not a fair game. That's not a fair game. So those rules have to be really clear. Imagine if there was a flagrant foul, they blew the whistle, and then they didn't penalize the team. There's no penalty. No penalty at all. Oh, well, hey, we'll do that again. They didn't push us back 5 yards. They didn't give them 2 free throws. You know, they didn't do it. There was no penalty. Well, that's the world we're living in politics. So imagine if we cared about sports. I mean, it's about politics as much as we cared about sports. We would have neutral third-side conveners that we could trust. We would have referees that were reliable and well-trained, and we would have ground rules and a playing field that was fair. Now, at the retreat, one of the first things we did, we brought together a microcosm of the house, and we said, you want a different experience at your retreat? They said, yes, we're counting on you to do that, they said to me and the other facilitators. I said, well, we can't do it unless you set some new ground rules. So the U.S. House of Representatives set new ground rules. They were respect for differences, openness to learning, fairness, which means equal time for equal speakers, confidentiality. They wanted a certain amount of confidentiality for parts of the meetings. They had some basic principles. And I must say that with the exception of one congressman who had to be reminded about language rules, everybody observed the ground rules for that weekend. And guess what happened on Monday? They went back to Capitol Hill. They went back to the old set of ground rules, which was basically win at all costs, and it all fell apart. Because the game is only as good as the ground rules and the officiating. So think about the consequences of those 3 things. If you have those 3 qualities, what happens on the playing field? You get full, high-quality participation. What happens if there's that first, 2 or 3 bad calls? You'll notice people start pushing each other, they start hitting each other, they start screaming at the refs, they start arguing, and often there's some violence that breaks out unless it's handled cleanly, clearly, and fairly. Well, that's essentially what's happening in our civic life. That's essentially what's happening in our civic life. We don't have these ingredients. And the result of that is that we don't have full, high-quality participation, which is the fourth practice. Why did we have full, high-quality participation in the NCAA finals? Those were beautiful games in the Final Four. Absolutely beautiful games, hard-fought, passionately fought, down to the last few minutes, sometimes the last few seconds. Both sides, when it was finished, immediately accepted the results. There was no, let's have a recount, it's going to take 6 weeks. Immediate acceptance. Damn, we were 1 point short, 3 points short. anger, disappointment, that the losing team is heartbroken. The winning team, they've won by this little hair's breadth. They're out there, screaming and celebrating on the field like, they're total heroes. And everybody accepts the outcome. And they give their whole hearts to it because they're not afraid of a beer bottle hitting them in the head. They're not afraid of fouls. They're going to, at least in basketball and when the game is played clean in football, they're not afraid of being intentionally, willfully hurt. They're not afraid of being lied about in the press the next day. They're not afraid about having millions and millions of dollars of lies and innuendo said about them and who they are on television so their kids watch it. They're not afraid of any of that. They're playing a sport that feels clean and honest. There's not a gambling racket behind it. There's not a mafia behind it. They can be proud to play and know they're going to get a fair shake. So that allows, Russell Wilson, that allows the Seahawks to go out there and play like superstars. And I would have liked the Broncos to do better. But the Seahawks did a fabulous job and they all played well. And that's what's missing in our politics. It's not a safe playing field. There aren't shared ground rules. There aren't referees we can trust. And there's not a neutral convener. So that's part of the challenge of the transpartisan movement, my friends, is how do we make our politics as powerful and as the games we play? Because politics is not a game. Politics is something that really matters off the field. So let's learn from the things we already do well. Let's think to ourselves, if a sports field is designed so well, if an operating room is designed so beautifully, if a cockpit of an airplane is designed so magnificently, if our iPads and our iPhones are so well constructed, how can we construct a democratic republic worthy of who we are and worthy of being one of the oldest and most venerated democracies in the world? That's the challenge of the transpartisan movement, and as of today, you're a part of it. Thank you. Thank you.